Stray dog barks 3 times in court. Seconds later, everyone is stunned. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Every seat occupied by spectators eager to witness the high-profile trial of Richard Calloway, a businessman with a pristine public image now facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. The air felt thick with anticipation as prosecutor Erin Blake took her place, her sharp eyes scanning the jury. Across from her, Calloway sat composed, dressed in an expensive suit, his attorney whispering reassurances in his ear. The evidence against him was substantial, but Calloway had spent years crafting an untouchable persona. This trial was more than just a legal battle, it was a test of whether justice could truly prevail against power and wealth. Judge Wallace entered, his gavel striking with authority as he called for order. Erin adjusted her papers, ready to present her opening arguments when suddenly, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Gasps rippled through the crowd as a large German shepherd sprinted inside, barking with urgency. The dog's powerful frame and sharp, intelligent eyes signaled that this wasn't just any stray, this was a trained canine. For a moment, confusion reigned. Bailiffs rushed to intercept the dog, but it dodged them with practiced agility, weaving through rows of stunned onlookers until it reached the center of the courtroom. Its bark reverberated through the air, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Judge Wallace's stern voice demanded control. "Whose dog is this? Remove it at once." But the dog remained undeterred, its attention locked onto Calloway, growling low and menacingly. Calloway, usually calm and composed, shifted uneasily in his seat, his hands clenching the arms of his chair. The canine took a step forward, its fur bristling as if it recognized something no one else could see. One of the bailiffs hesitated, exchanging a glance with his partner. "Sir, the dog's wearing a police collar," he said, his voice uncertain. Erin's sharp gaze landed on the dog's neck, where a tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Attached to its collar was something small but distinct, a key. Curiosity outweighed protocol as Erin stepped forward, cautiously extending her hand. The dog, though alert, didn't resist as she carefully unhooked the key from its collar. She examined it, her heartbeat accelerating when she noticed an engraved serial number, a bank vault key. A murmur of speculation rippled through the courtroom as she turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe this could be relevant evidence." Calloway's lawyer immediately objected, but Judge Wallace raised a hand. "Ms. Blake, do you have any indication as to what that key belongs to?" Erin hesitated for only a second before responding. "I'd need to verify, but if this key belongs to a vault, it could contain crucial documents pertaining to this case." Judge Wallace considered this, rubbing his temple as the courtroom waited with bated breath. Finally, he sighed. "Given the unusual circumstances, I'll grant a brief recess for the prosecution to investigate." Erin wasted no time. She quickly motioned for one of her aides, handing over the key. "Get this checked immediately. Contact every major bank under Calloway's known aliases." The aide nodded and rushed out. Meanwhile, the German shepherd, having delivered its apparent message, sat beside Erin, panting lightly but no longer agitated. Erin knelt down, running a hand over the dog's coat. "Where did you come from, boy?" she murmured. But of course, there was no answer, only the lingering intensity in the dog's eyes. 15 minutes later, her aide returned, breathless. "We found a match. The key belongs to a safety deposit box under an alias tied to Calloway. One he didn't disclose in financial records." The courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers. Erin straightened, glancing at Calloway, whose face had paled significantly. His defense attorney leaned in, whispering furiously, but Calloway's jaw was tight. His gaze locked on the canine as if he recognized it. That alone sent a chill down Erin's spine. Before she could press further, Judge Wallace brought his gavel down. "Court will reconvene in 1 hour. The prosecution is authorized to retrieve the contents of the deposit box under court supervision." As Erin and the investigators left the courthouse, the German shepherd followed, tail high and ears alert. No one stopped it. Something about the dog's rival felt too deliberate to ignore. At the bank, Erin and her team stood as officials verified their warrant and retrieved the safety deposit box. Inside, they found a stack of documents, bank transfers, offshore accounts, and most damning of all, a ledger listing payouts to individuals suspected of aiding Calloway in covering up illicit activities. But there was something else, tucked at the bottom of the box of photograph. Erin's breath hitched as she pulled it out. It was a surveillance image of a dog fighting ring, and at the center of the image was the same German shepherd that had stormed into the courtroom. Erin turned to the dog, whose eyes burned with something almost human determination, perhaps even vengeance. "You weren't just looking for justice," she whispered. "You were looking for him." Erin stood frozen in the bank's secure room, her fingers tightening around the photograph as she tried to make sense of what she was looking at. The grainy image showed a darkened warehouse, a makeshift arena surrounded by shadowy figures. In the center, dogs were locked in a brutal fight, their bodies tense with fear and pain. And there, unmistakable even through the poor quality picture, was the same German shepherd that had stormed the courtroom justice. His stance was defensive, his head low, his muscles coiled not in aggression but in defiance. He had not been a willing participant in whatever horror had taken place that night. Erin's stomach twisted. How had a K-9 officer ended up here? She crouched beside Justice, running her fingers through his thick fur as he watched her, his deep brown eyes filled with something more than simple K-9 loyalty. "You escaped from this, didn't you?" she murmured. "You've been trying to tell us something all along." The dog didn't move, but his ears twitched as though he understood. Behind her, Henry Lawson, the retired officer she had called in for help, stepped forward. He had remained silent as the bank officials secured the evidence, but now, looking over Erin's shoulder at the photo, he exhaled sharply. "I know that look," he said, nodding toward Justice. "That's not just any dog. That's a dog who's seen the worst of humanity and survived it." Erin turned to him, still gripping the photograph. "If Calloway's connected to this, we're dealing with more than just white-collar crime. This is animal abuse, illegal gambling, and possibly even organized crime." Henry nodded grimly. "And Justice here, he might just be the key to proving it." They wasted no time. Erin called for an emergency hearing, and within hours, they were back in the packed courtroom. Calloway had composed himself, though his fingers drummed against the table in a rare display of anxiety. His lawyer stood rigid beside him, bracing for the storm Erin was about to unleash. The courtroom murmured as the new evidence was introduced, a direct link between Calloway and a ring of illegal dog fights. As the projector displayed the photograph for the jury to see, gasps rippled through the crowd. The once sterile case of financial crime now had a horrific, emotional weight. "Your Honor," Erin began, her voice steady but charged with restrained fury, "we have uncovered evidence that the defendant was not only engaged in embezzlement, but was also financially supporting underground dog fights, profiting from the torture and suffering of these animals. And as you can see in this photograph, one of the victims was none other than the K-9 unit now known as Justice." Justice, as if on cue, let out a low, rumbling growl that sent a chill through the room. Erin continued, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "This dog," she gestured to Justice, "was once part of a dedicated police force, trained to protect and serve. Yet, somehow, he ended up in the hands of Calloway's associates, forced into a ring to fight for survival. But he didn't fight, did he?" She turned to Henry, who had been studying the photograph. He cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. "No," Henry said, stepping forward. "I've trained K-9s my whole life. What you see in this image isn't a dog prepared to attack. You see hesitation. You see resistance. Justice wasn't a fighter. He refused, and that's why he escaped." Erin turned her attention back to Calloway, whose face had grown tight with barely concealed irritation. She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to a deliberate, dangerous calm. "You were laundering money through more than just fake businesses, weren't you, Mr. Calloway? You were funding these fights, profiting from them, while covering it up with your legitimate enterprises." His lawyer shot up, objecting loudly, but the judge overruled him, motioning for Erin to continue. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Erin reached for another document, Justice's old police records, showing his official status as a missing K-9. "Justice didn't just escape from that ring," she said, flipping through the file. "He came back to find you." Calloway scoffed, shaking his head. Are we seriously entertaining the idea that a dog is bringing forth legal evidence? This is ridiculous. But before Aaron could respond, Justice took a slow, deliberate step forward. Every eye in the courtroom locked onto him as he crossed the space between himself and Calloway. There was no barking, no growling this time, just an unbroken stare. A stare that unsettled even the most skeptical in the room. And then, in an act that stunned everyone, Justice raised his paw and pressed it against Calloway's chair. A silent accusation. A witness that could not speak, but whose actions spoke volumes. The courtroom was silent. Aaron, seizing the moment, let the weight of it sink in before speaking again. Your Honor, I move that Mr. Calloway be held without bail while we fully investigate the extent of his criminal activities, including illegal animal trafficking. The judge, visibly affected by the powerful display, nodded. Motion granted. Calloway stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. This is absurd. You're convicting me based on a dog? Aaron met his glare with unflinching determination. No, Mr. Calloway, she said smoothly. We're convicting you based on evidence. Justice just led us to it. The bailiffs moved in, placing Calloway in handcuffs as the courtroom erupted in hushed conversation. As he was led away, his gaze flickered just for a second back to the dog that had sealed his fate. Justice, as if knowing his work was done, sat back on his haunches, his tail flicking once before he turned his head toward Henry. The old officer knelt, placing a firm hand on the canine's head. You did good, boy, he murmured. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had already gathered. News cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions as Aaron, Henry, and Justice stepped into the open air. One journalist pushed forward, microphone extended. Ms. Blake, what's next for Justice? Aaron glanced at Henry, who gave her a small nod. She turned back to the reporters, smiling. Justice is going home. As Henry led Justice toward his waiting car, Aaron watched them go, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in her chest. This case had been about exposing corruption, but in the end, it had also been about redemption. A businessman who thought he could escape justice had been brought down not just by legal brilliance, but by the unwavering determination of a dog who refused to be silenced. And as the sun began to set over the city, Justice turned his head one last time toward the courthouse, as if acknowledging the battle they had just won. Then, with quiet dignity, he hopped into Henry's car, finally heading toward the peace he had long deserved. The city buzzed with the aftermath of the trial, the media feeding on every detail of Calloway's downfall. News stations played footage of the courtroom spectacle on a loop, with Justice's imposing figure taking center stage. Social media erupted with praise for the courageous canine, dubbing him the dog that took down a titan. But as the public reveled in the poetic justice of it all, Aaron Blake knew the fight wasn't over. Calloway was behind bars, but his empire had yet to crumble. His vast network of corruption, his hidden associates, and the shadowy world of illegal dog fights still thrived beyond the courtroom walls. Aaron sat in her office, exhausted yet unwilling to rest. Justice lay at her feet, his breathing slow and steady, his body finally at ease. He had played his part, but she suspected he knew, just as she did, that this wasn't truly the end. Across from her, Henry Lawson nursed a cup of coffee, his eyes thoughtful. Calloway's done, he said, voice gruff. But I don't think he was the one running the underground fights. He was laundering money, sure, probably funding it. But organizing? No. That takes someone who knows the business inside and out. Aaron nodded, running a hand through her hair. I was thinking the same thing. He had connections, but the fights, that's a whole different level of crime. And then there's the bigger question, how did Justice end up there? K9 units don't just vanish. Someone took him. Someone with resources. Henry's face darkened. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Aaron tapped a pen against her desk, staring at the files in front of her. We need to find out where those fights were held. Justice might be the only living witness we have. At that, Justice lifted his head, ears perking slightly as if responding to his name. Aaron exhaled sharply, a half-smile touching her lips. I swear, sometimes I think he understands every word we say. Henry chuckled. That's because he does. The moment of levity passed quickly as Aaron opened a folder containing the evidence retrieved from Calloway's deposit box. Financial transactions linked to offshore accounts, payments made to unidentified individuals. But one name stood out: a shell company called Apex Security. Henry stiffened when he saw it. "I know that name." Aaron looked up sharply. "How?" He rubbed his jaw, his expression unreadable. "Back when I was on the force, we had suspicions about Apex. They claimed to provide high-end security for private events, but there were always rumors. Unlicensed weapons, off-the-books contracts. We could never pin anything on them, though. They covered their tracks too well." Aaron leaned forward. "Do you think they were running the fights?" "I'd bet my badge on it," Henry muttered. "If Calloway was funneling money into them, then Apex had the infrastructure. Private warehouses, controlled environments, access to trained dogs." His gaze shifted to Justice. "And a way to make K9 South disappear." Aaron felt her stomach turn. "That means there are others." A heavy silence filled the room. If Justice had been taken, then how many other police dogs had been stolen, repurposed, and thrown into brutal fights? How many had never made it out? She looked down at Justice, her heart tightening. "We have to find them," Henry nodded. "We will." The next morning, Aaron and Henry met with Detective Adrian Wells, a hard-nosed investigator known for his relentless pursuit of organized crime. When Aaron laid out the connection between Calloway, Apex Security, and the underground dog fights, Wells whistled low. "That's a hell of a web," he said, flipping through the files. "If Apex is running this, they're doing it smart. No online records, no paper trails beyond what we found in Calloway's stash." Henry crossed his arms. "They'll have a location. These fights aren't mobile. They need a fixed place to train, house, and stage the events." Wells nodded. "I might have something on that." He pulled out his phone and scrolled before turning the screen toward them. "Apex owns a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Officially, it's listed as a storage facility. But I did some digging, no real activity on the books. No employees registered. And get this, neighbors report hearing strange noises at night. Loud barking. Engines coming and going." Aaron and Henry exchanged glances. Henry's expression hardened. "That's it. That's where they're keeping the dogs." Wells pocketed his phone. "I can get a warrant, but we need probable cause beyond the finances." Aaron's mind raced. They needed someone on the inside. Someone who could confirm, without a doubt, that Apex was holding those dogs. And suddenly, she knew exactly who that someone was. Justice. That night, under the cover of darkness, Henry and Aaron arrived near the Apex warehouse. Justice sat in the back seat of Henry's truck, his body rigid, his breathing steady. He knew this was more than just another night. He could smell it in the air: danger, memories, something unfinished. Henry exhaled slowly, his fingers resting on the wheel. "I don't like this," he muttered. Aaron adjusted the small camera attached to Justice's collar, ensuring the live feed would transmit directly to Wells. "He's our best shot," she said. Henry didn't argue. He knew it was true. Justice had led them this far. He would lead them the rest of the way. They parked a block away, close enough to see the warehouse, but far enough to avoid suspicion. Aaron leaned into the back seat, stroking Justice's head. "You ready, boy?" Justice's tail thumped once. His eyes locked onto hers. No hesitation, no fear. Henry opened the door, and Justice leapt out, his body low, his movements silent. He trotted toward the fence, slipping through a gap in the metal. Aaron and Henry watched from a distance as the camera feed flickered to life, broadcasting a grainy black and white view of Justice's perspective. He moved like a shadow, nose to the ground, ears pricked, and then, suddenly, a sound. A whimper. Justice froze, then turned sharply, following the noise. The camera revealed a row of cages, each one housing a dog: German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, pit bulls. Some bore fresh wounds, their eyes dull with exhaustion. Others perked up at Justice's rival, sensing something different about him. A low growl rumbled through the air, and the camera caught a figure stepping into view: a man. Muscular, armed, scanning the area. Aaron's pulse spiked. "They have guards." Henry reached for his phone. "We need to move." But before he could call it in, the man stiffened, eyes narrowing. He had spotted Justice. What the hell? The screen cut to static. Aaron's breath caught. Henry cursed. And then, in the distance, a sharp, furious bark cut through the night. Justice wasn't running. Justice was fighting. The sound of Justice's bark shattered the night, a deep, commanding call that sent a chill through Aaron's spine. The screen remained dark, the camera feed lost, but the message was clear: he had been discovered. Henry was already moving, yanking open the truck door and reaching for his sidearm, his face a mask of controlled fury. "We goin' now," he said, voice low but filled with an urgency Aaron had never heard before. She didn't argue. They had planned to wait for Wells and the backup team to do this by the book. But the rules had just changed. Justice was in danger, and that meant all bets were off. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, their eyes locked on the looming warehouse ahead. The building was old, its walls rusted from years of neglect, but the faint glow of floodlights overhead revealed something more: a fortress disguised as decay. High fences, security cameras, and armed men patrolling the perimeter. Apex hadn't just been running an operation. They had built an empire. Aaron clenched her jaw, pressing against the cold metal of a storage container as a guard passed by, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The faint hum of a generator vibrated in the air, masking the distant growls and whimpers of the dogs inside. Henry knelt beside her, eyes scanning the area. "We need to find him fast," he murmured. Aaron nodded, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. "Justice will find us first," she whispered. As if on cue, a scuffle erupted inside the warehouse, followed by a sharp, pained yell. Then another bark, fierce, unrelenting. Justice was fighting. Henry motioned for Aaron to move, and they crept toward the side entrance, careful to avoid the roaming lights. The lock was old, rusted from neglect, and Henry made quick work of it with his knife. The door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside, swallowed instantly by the darkness. The stench hit them: first blood, sweat, and the unmistakable scent of fear. Rows of cages lined the walls, the dull gleam of eyes reflecting in the low light. Dogs, all of them battered, some too weak to stand, others pacing anxiously. Aaron swallowed the lump in her throat. They were too late to save some of them, but not all. Not Justice. A sudden crash echoed from deeper within, followed by frantic shouting. Henry moved first, gun raised, his steps silent as they navigated the narrow corridor between cages. Aaron followed, adrenaline surging through her veins. They reached an open space, a crude fighting pit surrounded by metal barriers, stained from past horrors. And there, at the center of it all, was Justice. His coat was slick with sweat and dirt, his chest rising and falling in rapid bursts. But he wasn't backing down. Opposite him stood a man, broad and furious, clutching a metal pipe, his lips split and bleeding. Justice's growl rumbled low and steady, his stance poised to strike. The man spat to the side, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Dan dog," he muttered, lifting the pipe. "Should have stayed in your cage." Aaron didn't hesitate. "Drop it," she called, stepping into the light, her gun trained on him. The man froze, eyes darting toward her, then to Henry, who had already positioned himself at an angle, ready to take the shot if necessary. Justice didn't move, his eyes locked on the man, his body trembling with rage. The warehouse fell into a charged silence, the only sound the ragged breaths of the man who had made the mistake of thinking he could control a dog like Justice. "You don't know what you're walking into," he sneered, straightening slightly, his fingers tightening around the pipe. "You think taking me in is gonna stop this?" Aaron took a step closer, her grip steady. "I think you should be more worried about the fact that you just got taken down by a dog." The man's jaw twitched, but he didn't lower his weapon. Henry exhaled sharply. "We don't have time for this." In a blur of motion, Justice lunged, his powerful frame crashing into the man's legs, sending him sprawling to the ground. The pipe clattered from his grip as Justice pinned him, teeth bared inches from his throat. The man froze, barely breathing. "Call him off," he rasped, eyes wide. Aaron holstered her weapon, stepping forward. "Where are the rest?" The man said nothing. Justice growled, his weight pressing harder against the man's chest, a silent warning. "Where?" Aaron repeated, her voice a blade's edge. A long pause. Then, through gritted teeth, the man muttered, "There's another site. Bigger." Southside docks. That's where the real fights happen. Aaron's stomach turned. This was just one piece of a much larger operation. Henry stepped forward, securing the man's wrists with a zip tie before yanking him up. "Wells is on his way," he muttered. "We need to clear this place before they wipe the evidence." Aaron nodded, turning back to Justice, who still stood, his body taut with energy. He had done his job, but it wasn't over yet. She knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his side. "Good boy," she murmured. "But we're not done." Justice met her gaze, eyes burning with something fierce. He already knew. The warehouse was a storm of movement as Wells and his team arrived, sweeping through the grim structure with methodical precision, securing evidence, and freeing the surviving dogs from their filthy cages. The captured Apex enforcer had been hauled off in handcuffs, his face twisted in rage, but his silence forced by the weight of his own failure. Aaron stood amidst the chaos, her pulse still racing, the reality of what they had uncovered pressing down on her. This wasn't just about Calloway anymore. The Southside docks, if what the man had said was true, was where the heart of the operation lay. The fights weren't just some underground event for a handful of gamblers. They were an empire built on suffering, a machine that chewed up loyal, trained K-9 South and turned them into weapons or victims, whichever brought the most money. And Justice, standing tall beside her, had nearly been one of them. Henry paced a few feet away, talking low into his phone, no doubt calling in favors, moving pieces on the board that only he knew how to shift. When he turned, his expression was unreadable. "We go now," he said, slipping his phone into his pocket. "If we wait, they'll scatter. We hit them hard, we hit them fast." Aaron didn't hesitate. "Then let's end this." The docks were eerily quiet when they arrived, the scent of salt water mixing with the stench of oil and rotting wood. The only sounds were the occasional lapping of waves against the pier, and the distant creak of shifting metal from the abandoned shipping containers that littered the lot. But Justice knew better. His body was tense, ears pricked forward, nose twitching as he scanned the darkness. He knew what lurked beyond sight. Aaron and Henry flanked him, moving like shadows between the rows of stacked crates, eyes scanning the dimly lit path ahead. The warehouse at the end of the pier was alive with muted noise, voices low and secretive, the occasional sharp bark cutting through the stillness. It was there, the last stronghold, the final battleground. Wells and his team moved into position, spreading out, ensuring no one could slip away. This was it. Aaron took a slow breath, steeling herself. Then Henry signaled, "Go." They moved in as one, bursting through the entrance, weapons raised, shouts filling the space. The interior was a grotesque theater of cruelty. A makeshift arena had been built in the center, surrounded by men clutching betting slips, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. Cages lined the walls, holding dogs too broken to fight, but too valuable to kill. And at the far end of the warehouse, standing amidst the chaos, was the orchestrator of it all, a man Aaron recognized from the files Marcus Vance, the true mastermind behind Apex's operations. He didn't panic. He didn't flee. He simply smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Aaron's blood run cold. "You took your time," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had spent years convincing people to ignore their consciences. Henry raised his gun. "Hands where I can see them." Vance exhaled through his nose, almost amused, before raising his hands in mock surrender. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "You think shutting this place down changes anything? There's always going to be another ring, another buyer, another fight. You can't stop demand." Aaron's fingers tightened around her weapon, fury burning behind her ribs. "Maybe not," she admitted, "but I can sure as hell stop you." And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw it. Movement. A man reaching for a weapon. A split second of decision. But Justice saw it first. He moved like lightning, a blur of muscle and instinct, launching himself at the armed man before the gun could be drawn. The impact sent them both crashing to the ground, the weapon skidding across the floor. The fight erupted. Vance made a break for it, sprinting toward a side exit, but Henry was faster. He tackled him hard, pinning him down with a forearm against his back, years of training making the takedown effortless. The remaining enforcers tried to fight, but they were outnumbered, overpowered. Within minutes, it was over. The last of Apex's soldiers were in cuffs, the dogs freed, and the empire Vance had built had crumbled beneath his feet. Erin turned, breathless, scanning the room until she found Justice. He stood over the downed man, teeth bared, chest heaving. Victorious, Erin knelt beside him, pressing a hand against his fur, letting him feel the reassurance in her touch. "You did it," she whispered. Justice turned his head slightly, nudging her palm with his nose. He knew. In the days that followed, the world watched as the truth unraveled. Calloway's name was forever tied to the horrors of Apex's operation. The South Side docks were shut down, the surviving dogs placed into rehabilitation programs, many of them finding homes with former officers who understood the wounds that couldn't be seen. Vance was sentenced to life without parole. And Justice went home. Henry adopted him officially, though the truth was, the bond had been formed long before paperwork made it real. Erin visited often, watching as the once lost K9 found peace in the quiet countryside. His days now filled with open fields and warm sun rather than the cold, cruel walls of a fighting ring. One afternoon, as she sat on Henry's porch watching Justice chase a butterfly across the grass, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Closure. Henry leaned against the railing beside her, arms crossed. "You ever think about getting a dog?" Erin smiled, watching as Justice plopped onto his back, rolling happily in the grass. "I don't think I need to," she said softly. "I think I already found the best one." Justice lifted his head at that, ears twitching, as if he had heard her. Maybe he had. Maybe he always would.